September 1939. Britain had just declared war on Germany, and the Air Ministry faced a problem that was killing air crews at an alarming rate. Every time a reconnaissance aircraft crossed into enemy territory to photograph German positions, it became a flying target. The solution seemed obvious to everyone. Arm these aircraft to the teeth, give them guns, armor plating, and let them fight their way out if intercepted. Except this approach was failing spectacularly. The Bristol Blenheim served as the RAF's primary reconnaissance aircraft in those early months. Modified with cameras and still carrying its defensive armament, these twin-engine bombers lumbered over enemy territory at roughly 260 miles per hour. Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, by contrast, could reach 350 mph and climb faster than any British bomber could dive. The mathematics were brutally simple. You cannot outrun what is fundamentally faster than you, and you cannot outgun a dedicated fighter when you are carrying cameras and fuel instead of bombs. Between September and December 1939, the losses mounted with sickening regularity. Blenheim crews would cross the German border, and many simply never returned. Those who did often came back with aircraft so riddled with bullet holes that ground crews wondered how they had stayed airborne. The few successful missions yielded photographs, certainly, but at what cost? Some reconnaissance squadrons reported loss rates exceeding 50% on certain operations. For every 2 aircraft that departed, only 1 might return. These were not sustainable numbers by any military standard. The Air Ministry's response followed conventional wisdom: add more guns, install heavier armor plating, increase defensive firepower. If Blenheims were vulnerable, the thinking went, then make them less vulnerable through protection. What this approach ignored was physics. Every pound of armor added was a pound that reduced speed, decreased ceiling altitude, and shortened range. The modified Blenheims became even slower, even more predictable, even easier targets. Luftwaffe pilots began to regard reconnaissance aircraft as little more than practice opportunities. The human cost extended beyond statistics. These were experienced aircrews, trained observers who understood what German installations to photograph, pilots who knew how to navigate deep into enemy territory and return. Each loss meant months of training wasted, irreplaceable experience gone, and vital intelligence gathering disrupted. By late autumn 1939, squadron commanders were filing increasingly desperate reports. The current approach was not working. Something fundamental had to change, but nobody in authority quite knew what. French reconnaissance units faced identical problems. Their Potez 63 and Block 174 aircraft suffered similar attrition rates. The Germans, meanwhile, had their own difficulties with Dornier Dose 17 and Henschel HC 126 reconnaissance aircraft being intercepted by RAF Hurricanes over British positions. Everyone understood the strategic importance of aerial reconnaissance. Modern warfare demanded knowing where enemy forces were positioned, where factories operated, where defences had been constructed. Yet the existing methods for gathering this intelligence were grinding aircrews into dust. What made the situation particularly frustrating was that the photographs, when successfully obtained, proved absolutely invaluable. Intelligence officers could count tanks, identify aircraft types, track troop movements, and spot new fortifications. The information was gold, but acquiring it resembled sending men into a shooting gallery where they were the targets. The Air Ministry needed a solution that did not simply accept these catastrophic loss rates as the inevitable price of reconnaissance. They needed something radical, something that challenged every assumption about how military aircraft should operate. They just did not know it yet. Enter Frederick Sidney Cotton, though everyone called him Sidney, an Australian businessman and pilot who had spent the 1930s flying private aircraft across Europe. Cotton possessed an outsider's perspective that proved invaluable. He was not a career RAF officer bound by doctrine and tradition. He was an entrepreneur who approached problems with a merchant's practicality. What works is what matters, and everything else is just noise. In early 1939, even before war was declared, Cotton had been conducting covert photographic flights over German territory in a civilian Lockheed 12A, ostensibly on business trips. The Secret Intelligence Service knew exactly what he was doing, and they were very interested in his results. Cotton had noticed something during these pre-war flights. Speed and altitude kept him safe, not guns. When he flew high and fast, German authorities barely noticed him. When they did notice, they could not catch him. This observation crystallized into a radical hypothesis. What if military reconnaissance aircraft abandoned weapons entirely and focused solely on not being caught in the first place? The idea violated every principle of military aviation, but Cotton had never been particularly concerned with convention. He found an ally in Flight Lieutenant Maurice Babs Longbottom, a young RAF officer who had been thinking along similar lines. Longbottom had examined the loss reports from Blenheim squadrons and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Defensive armament was not actually defending anyone. The guns added weight, the gunners added more weight, the armor added still more weight, and all of it made the aircraft slower and more vulnerable. You were carrying equipment meant to protect you that was actually making you easier to kill. The logic seemed perverse. In October 1939, Cotton and Longbottom submitted a joint proposal to the Air Ministry. Take the Supermarine Spitfire, then the fastest fighter in RAF service, and strip it of everything related to combat. Remove all 8 Browning machine guns and their ammunition. That was roughly 450 pounds immediately saved. Remove the armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Remove the gun sight. Remove the gun heating systems. In their place, install cameras in the fuselage and wings, add extra fuel tanks for extended range, and paint the entire aircraft a pale duck-egg blue that would blend with high-altitude skies. The result would be a reconnaissance aircraft that could cruise at 370 mph, reach altitudes above 40,000 feet, and simply outrun any interceptor the Luftwaffe possessed. The Air Ministry's reaction bordered on apoplectic. Senior officers called the proposal suicidal, insane, a waste of precious Spitfires. How could you send pilots over enemy territory with no means of defending themselves? What happened when, not if, but when, they encountered German fighters? The idea contradicted decades of military doctrine that said every aircraft needed defensive capability. Cotton's response was blunt. Your armed aircraft are being shot down at catastrophic rates, so clearly having guns is not helping. Try something different, or keep losing crews. What made the proposal particularly difficult to accept was its implicit admission that Britain could not outfight the Luftwaffe in every scenario. The Spitfire was supposed to be a symbol of British defiance and capability. Stripping it of weapons felt like surrender, like admitting inadequacy. Cotton and Longbottom were asking the RAF to embrace a philosophy that felt deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes running away is smarter than fighting. For an institution built on courage and confrontation, this required a fundamental shift in thinking that many senior officers simply could not make. Yet beneath the emotion and tradition, physics did not care about doctrine. The numbers told a story that was difficult to ignore once you actually examined them. A standard Spitfire. Kai carried 8.303 Browning machine guns, each weighing approximately 10 pounds. Add the ammunition, 300 rounds per gun, roughly 2,400 rounds total, and you had another 280 pounds. Include the gun heating mechanisms, electrical systems, compressed air bottles for firing, and the structural reinforcements needed to handle recoil forces. and the total weight of the armament system approached 450 pounds. The armor plating behind the pilot's seat added another 75 pounds. You were asking a Merlin engine to haul over 500 pounds of equipment that, in a reconnaissance role, served absolutely no purpose. Remove that weight, and the transformation was immediate. The Spitfire's maximum speed increased from roughly 362 mph to approximately 395 mph at optimal altitude. More significantly, its rate of climb improved dramatically. A combat-loaded Spitfire could reach 20,000 feet in about 9 minutes. The lightened reconnaissance variant could achieve the same altitude nearly 2 minutes faster, and it could continue climbing to altitudes where the air was so thin that standard fighters struggled to maintain engine performance. At 40,000 feet, the modified Spitfire could cruise comfortably whilst Messerschmitt Bf-109Es began experiencing serious power loss above 36,000 feet. The physics of aerial interception made these differences critical. When a German fighter spotted a reconnaissance aircraft, it had to accelerate, climb to match altitude and position itself for an attack, all whilst the target was moving away at maximum speed. If the reconnaissance aircraft maintained a 30 mph speed advantage and was already at high altitude, the geometry of pursuit became nearly impossible. The interceptor had to fly a curved path to catch up, covering significantly more distance than the straight-line path of its target. By the time the German pilot climbed to interception altitude, the Spitfire might already be 5 or 10 miles away, and that gap would only widen. Consider the tactical situation from the Luftwaffe pilot's perspective. Ground observers spot an aircraft at high altitude, radio the sighting to the nearest fighter base, and pilots scramble to intercept. This process alone consumed 5 to 8 minutes. The fighter then had to climb to altitude, perhaps another 8 to 10 minutes to reach 35,000 feet. Meanwhile, the reconnaissance Spitfire had been covering ground at 6 to 7 miles per minute. By the time the German fighter reached interception altitude, the target was already 80 to 100 miles away, potentially crossing back into friendly airspace, even if the interceptor gave chase at maximum speed. Closing a 30 mph speed gap over that distance required another 20 to 30 minutes of pursuit. Few fighters carried enough fuel for such extended chases at full throttle. The fuel equation worked heavily in favour of the unarmed Spitfire. Removing weapons and ammunition freed up space and weight for additional fuel tanks. Cotton's team installed extra tanks in the wings and fuselage, increasing total fuel capacity from 85 gallons to approximately 230 gallons in some variants. This extended range from roughly 400 miles to over 1,500 miles, allowing deep penetration missions into Germany that would have been impossible with standard fighters. More fuel meant you could fly higher for longer. Altitude required richer fuel mixtures and consumed more petrol, but the unarmed Spitfires could afford it. The aerodynamics contributed another advantage. Removing the gun port covers and fairings reduced drag slightly. Every bit of streamlining counted at maximum speed, where air resistance increased exponentially. Wind tunnel testing would later confirm that the cleaned-up reconnaissance Spitfires achieved marginally better lift-to-drag ratios than their armed counterparts. These were small improvements individually, but combined, they created a performance envelope that simply exceeded what any contemporary interceptor could match. Cotton did not wait for full Air Ministry approval. He had a talent for operating in bureaucratic grey areas, and by mid-October 1939, he had secured enough provisional authority to begin modifications at Heston Aerodrome, a civilian airfield west of London. The location was deliberate, away from formal RAF bases, away from officers who might ask uncomfortable questions, away from the rigid procedures that governed military installations. Cotton established what he called the Heston Flight, though it operated under various administrative designations that kept it conveniently vague in official paperwork. If the experiment failed, it could be quietly forgotten. If it succeeded, there would be plenty of people claiming credit. The first Spitfire arrived at Heston on 20 October 1939. The ground crew, mostly civilian mechanics recruited by Cotton, began the gutting process immediately. They removed the 8 Browning guns, extracting them from the wings along with their ammunition feeds and spent cartridge chutes. Out came the gun heating systems, the compressed air bottles, the electrical firing mechanisms. The armor plate behind the pilot's seat was unbolted and lifted away. Even the standard gun sight was removed. It served no purpose on an aircraft that would never engage in combat. Each component was catalogued and stored, partly for accountability and partly because nobody was entirely certain this experiment would not be reversed within weeks. Into the vacated spaces went cameras. The primary installation was an f/24 camera with an 8-inch lens, mounted vertically in the fuselage behind the cockpit, positioned to shoot straight down through a new opening in the aircraft's belly. This camera could capture extraordinarily detailed images from high altitude. From 30,000 feet, the 8-inch lens could resolve objects as small as 18 inches across, sufficient to identify vehicle types and count personnel. 2 additional f/24 cameras were installed in the wings for oblique photography, angled to capture side views of targets. The camera installations required careful balancing. Too far aft and the aircraft became tail-heavy. Too far forward and the center of gravity shifted dangerously. Fuel capacity received equal attention. Engineers installed a 30-gallon tank in the rear fuselage and a 29-gallon tank behind the pilot's seat, where the ammunition boxes had been. Additional tanks filled spaces in the wings formerly occupied by gun mechanisms. The plumbing required careful routing. Fuel lines had to avoid control cables, maintain proper venting to prevent vapor lock at altitude, and include shut-off valves so pilots could manage weight distribution during flight. Getting the fuel system right consumed weeks of testing. Early modifications suffered from fuel starvation at extreme altitudes until engineers redesigned the pump systems. Then came the paint. Cotton had experimented with camouflage schemes during his pre-war civilian reconnaissance flights and concluded that dark colors were exactly wrong for high-altitude operations. Looking up at 30,000 feet, you were staring into pale blue sky. An aircraft painted standard RAF dark green and brown stood out like a fly on a bedsheet. Cotton's solution was a custom mixed pale duck egg blue, sometimes described as camatint blue or simply PR blue. The entire aircraft, fuselage, wings, even the propeller spinner, received this distinctive color. From below, against the pale high-altitude sky, the Spitfire became extraordinarily difficult to spot. German fighter pilots would later report seeing nothing but empty sky, only to have intelligence confirm that British reconnaissance aircraft had indeed been overhead. The modifications extended to smaller details that revealed Cotton's attention to practical operation. The cockpit received additional oxygen equipment for extended high-altitude flight, including a more robust regulator system. The windscreen was treated with special compounds to prevent frosting at extreme altitude, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Additional navigation equipment was installed, including better compasses and drift indicators. These unarmed Spitfires would be flying long missions deep into enemy territory, often alone, and their pilots needed every advantage for navigation and survival. By mid-November 1939, the first modified Spitfire was ready. The pale blue aircraft sat on Heston's apron looking decidedly odd. Too light in color, too clean, missing the aggressive stance that gun ports gave a fighter. Maurice Longbottom would be the test pilot, which made perfect sense given he had co-authored the proposal. If this scheme failed catastrophically, at least one of its architects would share the consequences. The target selected for the first mission was Aachen, a German city near the Belgian border, housing railway infrastructure and military installations. The route would take Longbottom over approximately 150 miles of enemy territory, photograph the target area, and return, simple on paper, potentially fatal in execution. The morning of 18th November 1939 dawned cold and clear, perfect reconnaissance weather, which also meant perfect interception weather. Longbottom climbed into the cockpit, knowing that multiple Luftwaffe fighter bases lay along his route. Every conventional wisdom said he was about to fly a defenseless aircraft into lethal airspace. The ground crew had done their job. Now he would discover whether Cotton's physics arguments held up against German bullets. He advanced the throttle, felt the lightened Spitfire accelerate faster than any he had flown before, and lifted off into conditions that would have seemed suicidal just months earlier. The climb to altitude revealed the first advantage immediately. Longbottom reached 33,000 feet in less time than his standard Spitfire training had required to reach 25,000 feet. The Merlin engine, freed from hauling unnecessary weight, pulled the aircraft upward with almost eager responsiveness. He crossed the channel at altitude, the English coastline falling away behind him, and headed toward enemy territory with only speed and altitude for protection. No guns, no armor, no wingman flying escort. Just him, cameras, and Cotton's theory that not being catchable was better than being able to fight back. German radar stations detected his approach, though radar technology in late 1939 was primitive enough that high-altitude single aircraft often appeared as uncertain contacts. Fighter bases received alerts, and Messerschmitt pilots scrambled to intercept. Longbottom could see them down below, small shapes climbing toward him, but the mathematics of pursuit worked exactly as Cotton had predicted. By the time the German fighters reached 30,000 feet, Longbottom was already over Aachen at 34,000 feet, travelling at nearly 390 mph. The F-24 camera clicked away, capturing frame after frame of German railway yards, troop concentrations, and supply depots. The Luftwaffe pilots tried. They pushed their aircraft to maximum climb rate, burning fuel at prodigious rates, straining their engines in thin air. A few got close enough to see the pale blue Spitfire, a ghost against the sky, but closing that final distance proved impossible. Longbottom maintained his course and speed, completed his photographic run, and turned for home. The German fighters, now critically low on fuel after their maximum effort climb, had to break off and return to base. Not a single shot was fired. The unarmed reconnaissance Spitfire had penetrated deep into German airspace, photographed a strategic target, and returned completely untouched. When Longbottom landed back at Heston, the film went immediately to processing. Within hours, intelligence officers were examining photographs of remarkable clarity. The high-altitude perspective combined with the F-24's optics produced images where individual railway wagons could be counted, where troop formations were clearly visible, where equipment types could be identified. The intelligence haul from this single mission exceeded what multiple Blenheim sorties had achieved at horrific cost. More importantly, the aircraft had returned without damage, the pilot was uninjured, and the mission had proven the fundamental concept. You did not need guns if they could not catch you. The success of that first mission changed everything, though the Air Ministry moved with characteristic caution before committing fully to Cotton's approach. Throughout December 1939 and into early 1940, additional modified Spitfires entered service, and each mission reinforced the same pattern: high altitude, high speed, no interceptions, successful photography. The Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, formally established on 17th of January 1940 at Heston, became the operational home for these pale blue aircraft. What had begun as Cotton's maverick experiment was now official RAF policy, though getting there had required overcoming months of institutional resistance. The numbers told a story that silenced critics. Between January and May 1940, PR Spitfires flew 67 sorties over German-occupied territory. Only one aircraft was lost, and that was due to mechanical failure rather than enemy action, a survival rate of 98.5%. Compare that to the Blenheim squadrons still conducting armed reconnaissance, where loss rates hovered between 15 and 25% on contested missions. The mathematics were undeniable. You could send 10 Blenheims and expect to lose 2 or 3, or you could send 10 PR Spitfires and expect all of them back. The choice seemed obvious once presented in those terms. By the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, PR Spitfires were photographing Luftwaffe airfields, tracking German invasion preparations along the French coast, and monitoring ship movements in Channel ports. Pilots flew missions that would have been absolute suicide for armed reconnaissance aircraft. They cruised over Luftwaffe fighter bases at 38,000 feet, whilst German pilots scrambled below them, always too low, always too slow. The pale blue camouflage worked brilliantly. German ground observers often failed to spot the high-flying Spitfires until they had already passed, and by then alerts came too late for effective interception. The role expanded dramatically as the war progressed. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, PR Spitfires photographed Eastern Front positions. When Rommel's Africa Corps threatened Egypt, PR Spitfire variants operated from North African airfields, tracking tank formations and supply convoys across hundreds of miles of desert. The Malta-based PR units, flying from that besieged island, monitored Italian naval movements and photographed every Axis port in the Mediterranean. These missions often covered 1,200 miles or more, requiring pilots to navigate by dead reckoning over open water with no landmarks, but the extended fuel capacity made such operations feasible. Development of specialized variants continued throughout the war. The PR Maquet 4 variant, introduced in early 1941, carried even more fuel, 317 gallons total, giving it a range exceeding 2,000 miles. The PR MKXs, which arrived in 1943, featured the more powerful Merlin 60 series engine and could reach 44,000 feet, an altitude where even the improved Focke-Wulf FW190 struggled to operate effectively. Each iteration pushed the performance envelope further, maintaining the fundamental principle that speed and altitude provided better protection than any amount of armor or weaponry. The intelligence gathered proved absolutely vital to Allied operations. D-Day planning in 1944 relied heavily on PR Spitfire photographs of Normandy beaches, German defensive positions, and coastal fortifications. Between January and June 1944, PR units flew over 3,000 sorties, photographing the invasion area, producing more than 1.5 million individual images. These photographs revealed obstacles on beaches, identified artillery positions, tracked German troop movements, and provided the detailed intelligence that made the invasion possible. Without the unarmed Spitfire's ability to photograph heavily defended areas repeatedly and safely, D-Day would have been operating far more blindly. Throughout the entire war, PR Spitfire loss rates remained remarkably low. Various sources estimate survival rates between 95 and 97% across all theatres, depending on how mechanical failures and accidents were counted. Enemy action accounted for very few losses. The aircraft that Cotton and Longbottom had designed as a desperate gamble had become the most successful reconnaissance platform of the war. For Luftwaffe pilots, the pale blue Spitfires became a source of profound frustration. German fighter aces, who had shot down dozens of Allied bombers and fighters, found themselves utterly impotent against these high-altitude ghosts. Ground controllers would vector them toward contacts at extreme altitude. They would climb at maximum power until their engines protested and their oxygen systems struggled, and they would catch glimpses of the pale shape far above them. Then it would simply disappear, outrunning any pursuit attempt with maddening ease. You cannot shoot what you cannot catch, and you cannot catch what is fundamentally faster at an altitude your aircraft cannot sustain. The Germans called them Die Blauen Geister, the Blue Ghosts. The nickname carried equal parts grudging respect and genuine irritation. These reconnaissance aircraft violated the established order of aerial combat. Fighters were supposed to dominate the sky, bombers were supposed to be vulnerable, and everything followed clear hierarchies of predator and prey. The PR Spitfires disrupted that order. They were prey that refused to be caught, targets that remained permanently out of reach, enemies that won every encounter by simply not fighting. For pilots trained in aggressive interception tactics, this was psychologically disorienting. German commanders attempted various countermeasures, all of which proved ineffective. They positioned fighters at high altitude in standing patrols, but the fuel consumption of maintaining 35,000 feet for extended periods was prohibitive. A Bf-109 could cruise at that altitude for perhaps 20 minutes before needing to descend or return to base, whilst the PR Spitfire sailed past with hours of endurance remaining. They tried coordinated attacks with multiple fighters approaching from different altitudes, but the speed differential meant the Spitfire could simply run from whichever interceptor got closest. They experimented with ground-controlled interception techniques, vectoring fighters to predicted interception points, but the PR pilots varied their routes and altitudes enough to make such predictions useless. Some Luftwaffe pilots developed near-obsessive determination to down these reconnaissance aircraft. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, reportedly attempted multiple interceptions of PR Spitfires and never successfully engaged one. The aircraft would appear on the horizon, he would position for an attack, advance throttle to maximum, and watch the pale blue shape maintain its distance effortlessly. By the time he reached the altitude where the Spitfire had been, it was miles away and climbing higher still. Other experienced pilots reported similar experiences, endless climbs toward targets that remained frustratingly beyond reach. The psychological impact extended beyond individual frustration. Luftwaffe fighter units were supposed to defend German airspace, yet these British aircraft photographed German cities, military bases, and industrial facilities with apparent impunity. Ground troops would ask why fighters had not stopped the reconnaissance flights overhead. Civilians questioned why defenses seemed powerless. The pilots had no satisfactory answer. They tried, they genuinely tried, but the physics simply did not allow success. This created a sense of helplessness that damaged morale far more than direct combat losses might have. German intelligence knew what the photographs were being used for. When Allied bombers struck factories that had been photographed days earlier, the connection was obvious. When invasion forces landed on beaches that PR Spitfires had mapped extensively, the intelligence pipeline was clear. The Luftwaffe was losing the reconnaissance war comprehensively, and they could do nothing to prevent it. Every successful PR mission represented intelligence that would be used against Germany, and the inability to stop these missions represented a fundamental failure of air defense. By 1943, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine essentially conceded defeat regarding high-altitude photo reconnaissance. Standing orders acknowledged that interception of aircraft operating above 40,000 feet was unlikely to succeed, and that pursuit attempts should be discontinued if closure is not achieved within 5 minutes. This was surrender dressed in operational language. The Germans had tried everything, and nothing worked. The principle that Cotton and Longbottom fought to establish, that reconnaissance aircraft should rely on performance rather than armament, did not end with the Second World War. It became foundational doctrine that shaped every subsequent generation of surveillance aircraft. When the United States began developing high-altitude reconnaissance platforms during the Cold War, they looked directly at the PR Spitfire experience for guidance. The result was the Lockheed U-2, introduced in 1955, which took the concept to extraordinary extremes: operational ceiling above 70,000 feet, no defensive armament whatsoever, designed purely to fly higher and faster than Soviet interceptors could reach. The U-2 philosophy was pure Cotton. Do not fight, do not defend,